Welcome to Auto Fix Pal. Today we have a 2006 Nissan Altima with a 3.5 liter V6 and we are going to change the spark plugs, so let's get to it. First thing you'll want to do is remove the engine cover, and they're held on by 5mm hex bolts. So just take those bolts out as you see pictured or in the video. Take the engine cover off, and then we're going to start with the front 3 ignition coils. We're going to remove the front 3 ignition coils. They're held on by 10mm bolts. You want to take all 3 of those 10mm bolts out. 10mm right there. And then there's one more on the 3rd coil that I did not show in the video, but you have to remove that 10mm bolts as well. Then you can just pull the coils right out of the hole and set them to the side. You can unplug them if you want to, but you don't necessarily have to unplug the front 3. And that's how you unplug it. You just squeeze that little tab down and you pull on it, and it should come right out of that ignition coil. 5/8 inch socket. That's a gear wrench magnetic swivel spark plug socket. Comes in handy. You don't have to worry about the rubber boot falling out and getting stuck on your spark plugs, and it just saves you a lot of time with playing around with those spark plug sockets that have the rubber boots that keep the spark plugs from falling out of the socket. Alright, so just make sure that the gap is the correct size. Most of the time the spark plugs will come pre-gapped, especially if you get them from Nissan, but you always want to verify that the gap is correct because they could have been dropped, they could have been set incorrectly from the factory. So just verify that the gap is the same. I believe it's 45 thousandths on most Nissan vehicles are 45 thousandths of an inch, so just verify that, and also make sure that you have the correct spark plug. Sometimes they'll give you the wrong parts and you don't want to put the wrong plugs in your car. You can run them down with a tool, but just be careful not to over tighten them, and then you tighten them up by hand. Always start them by hand though. Always start the spark plugs inside the cylinder head by hand. You can run them down with your impact gun, but just don't run them down with an impact gun. Just run them down with something that's low power, and then tighten them up by hand to the final torque. And we can pretty much finish up with the front 3 ignition coils. Put the 10mm bolts in, tighten those up. Put the coils in first, and then put the 10mm bolts in and tighten them up. Now the next thing you're going to do is remove the intake manifold to get to the spark plugs in the rear bank. That is cylinders 1, 3, and 5. So you're going to remove the 10mm from that bracket. Put your 10mm bolt back in the manifold so you don't lose it, and you don't have to worry about where it goes later on. And what you're going to do is basically take the entire intake manifold up and swing it off to the side so that you can get to the spark plugs on that rear bank of cylinders 1, 3, and 5. Then you're going to remove that 12mm right there that's holding that vacuum reservoir onto the intake manifold. Get that out of the way. You put your 12mm bolt back into the manifold. Then you're going to remove that bracket holding the vacuum lines that that's pictured, as shown in the video. Alright, now you're going to take your 10mm and remove the intake manifold boot, that little rubber boot that goes to the air filter. One side's a 10mm, the other side's an 8mm. Loosen those up, loosen those clamps up. Then you take your 90-degree needle nose pliers and take off the breather for the PCV system. It goes to the valve cover. Just undo the clamp and then slide that breather hose off of the intake boot. And then take the boot completely out of the car. Well, you don't have to take it out of the car, but just get it out of your way. Put it to the side and move on. Next, we are going to take off the EGR tube. We're going to unplug the EGR, the gas temperature sensor, the exhaust gas temperature sensor. Get that out to the side. Then you're going to get your 12mm socket on your impact gun. Take out those 12mm bolts on the EGR tube on the side of the intake that you see pictured right there. Pay attention to the order of those washers and that nut, because they have to go back on in the same order. We got the Bosch PS82 3/8 inch impact wrench. The thing is nice, fits in everywhere. Go and get yourself one. Links in the description. So next you're going to grab yourself a E8 external torque socket and remove the studs for the EGR tube. You don't have to remove those studs, but if you do remove those studs, it will make your job a lot easier. It'll make your life a lot easier. There'll be a lot less cursing and screaming at this car. So just go ahead and take those studs out and save yourself some headache. And after you've gotten those studs removed, we're going to go ahead and work on the intake manifold bolts. There's 2 nuts at the ends. Well, there's 1 nut at each end. Well, you got to smack that EGR tube with a hammer to break it free sometimes, because it's been on there for a while and it gets stuck. Now be mindful of that gasket. There is a gasket in between that EGR tube, so make sure you keep that gasket intact or get yourself a new gasket. Now you're going to take a 10mm bolt off of that vacuum switching valve. Put that to the side, stick it back in. Now you get your 12mm and take off the intake manifold bolts. There's a nut there and there's a nut at the opposite end. You're going to undo those 2 nuts. They're 12mm, and then there's 3 bolts in the center. Those are 12mm. You're going to take those out.
You see, stereophonic sound for the home is recorded on 2 separate tracks, each one giving special emphasis to certain sections of the orchestra, as heard from those positions.
Now you're going to remove those studs at the ends of the intake manifold as well. Those are also E8 external torques. So go ahead and grab that socket and remove those studs. Again, you don't have to take those studs out, but removing those studs will make this job a lot easier. And that's what they look up. That's what they look like up close. Now in the back, there is a bracket that holds the intake manifold. It supports the back of the intake manifold, and that bracket is holding it with 2 bolts, 2 12mm bolts in the back. And what you're going to want to do is reach your hand back there and just watch the video. There's a 12mm bolt right there, and then there's another 12mm bolt right next to it. You have to remove those 2 12mm bolts, and that will free the bracket up from the intake manifold, from the upper intake manifold, and you will be able to remove it from the engine at that time. After you've taken those 2 12mm bolts out. That Milwaukee is awesome. It can fit in so many places. I have a video coming up that compares the size of the M12 Milwaukee cordless ratchet with the snap-on 3/8" cordless ratchet, and the Milwaukee is quite a bit smaller. Naturally the snap-on is more powerful because it's higher voltage, but the Milwaukee can fit into a lot of places that snap-on just can't. And the Milwaukee has enough torque to get a lot of fasteners loose that are in those tight spaces. Yep, there's a preview right there. So subscribe, make sure you subscribe to get notifications. Click that bell right there at the bottom so that you're notified every time I post a new video. Alright, so now that you have that bracket removed, you should be able to move that intake manifold around a lot easier. And eventually you'll be able to get it out. But there is more stuff in the back of the intake manifold that we do have to remove. So just watch the video, and I did get a close-up of that as well. That's my little Sony camera. I like that little camera. That thing fits into everywhere, and the picture quality is pretty good as well, as you're going to see. So back there you have 2 connectors and 2 vacuum lines that you have to remove. One of them is the PCV vacuum line, and the other one is for the brake booster. But let's focus on those connectors. You're going to push that little tab in the middle that you can see in the video. Push it in. Sometimes it snaps back and locks in place. Sometimes it doesn't, and you'll have to pull on it and push at the same time, but I got lucky this time. Just pushed it in and it clicked in place, and I was able to just pull that plug right off of the bracket. Now I'm going to do the same thing with the other plug, and you can see it right there in the video. Just pushing it in with my pick, 90-degree pick. Push it in, and it clicked into place, so I should be able to pull it right up. Or maybe not. I think I had to do that one twice. No, that one came up easy as well. Yeah, I did have to push that one in twice. Yeah, sometimes you get lucky on the first try, sometimes you don't, but just push that little tab in and pull up. You can see I'm having to push and pull at the same time on that one. And then slide it up out of the bracket. Next, you're going to remove those two vacuum lines. That one right there. And then the other one off to the right. Right there. Now after you've gotten those two vacuum hoses removed, you should be able to remove the intake manifold without any issues. Don't drop your needle nose pliers back there. I almost dropped them. Yeah, I'm sorry about the light. I'm using my headlight, and sometimes that thing creates a crazy glare. It makes it a little hard for the camera to see what's going on. Alright, so now that those vacuum lines are out of the way, let's show you what's going on. There is one other thing that has to be removed. That's a 12mm facing the firewall, and that is for the power steering hose, power steering pressure hose. It is attached to the back of the intake manifold. And of course that runs all the way down to the power steering rack, so without removing that bracket, you will not be able to get that intake manifold up. So take care of that 12mm in the back, get your 1/4-inch ratchet. I am using a magnetic socket, a magnetic 12mm Sun X socket on there to keep the ratchet on the nut without me having to play around with it too much, and it'll keep me from dropping that nut all the way down into the engine compartment and losing it, because it's magnetic and it'll hold it and it won't fall. Good stuff. Links in the description. 'Cause I know then you'll see we could be true. But as you see, you should be able to get your hand back there and pull that nut out, pull that bolt out once you get it loose. Something so real, something so real. I want you to see that. Alright, so now you should be able to move the intake manifold up out of the way and get to the rear coils in the back. Or the rear spark plugs. That's your main goal, is to get to the rear spark plugs. Cylinders 1, 3, and 5. And there's a little tray up underneath that EGR tube, so you're going to want to slide it to the left and up. You'll see. I did do a close-up of that, I believe. That guy in the video is pretty good. Yeah. Alright, don't forget to unplug your EGR valve, because that will stop you from moving it. And I believe I did have to unplug the throttle body. I don't remember, but I don't know what that is I unplugged. I don't remember what sensor that is or what actuator that's controlling. But just unplug that blue plug and unplug that. Disconnect the little plastic clip that holds that wire on to the intake manifold, because that's going to stop you from lifting it. I don't think I got a close-up of that, but it's really close to that blue plug.
In time, my heart still feels the breaking, but you make my world so bright, feels so right. It feels so.
All right, so now we're going to take those coils out, 3 10mm bolts.
That what we've got is real, there's no denying. There's no
See that? Look, that Bosch fits up in there, gets them out real quick. You know, I could use the electric ratchet in there as well, but that's faster.
It's terrifying. And how will we ever know if the love will ever?
So pull the coils out, all 3 of them, set them to the side. You don't even have to unplug them. Just slide them out of the holes and lift them up out of the way. Then do the same thing you did for the front bank. Get your 5/8 inch socket. You may need an extension because look how deep it is. Look how far down it is. Run them out with your impact wrench if you can fit it in there.
Have you ever felt?
Are you listening? Damn.
Get your 3 new spark plugs ready. Make sure you check the gap. Make sure you check that they're the correct spark plugs.
Yeah.
Compare them to the old ones. Make sure that they match up.
Yeah.
Don't drop your spark plugs because if you do drop them, you will have to set the gap or replace the spark plug if you crack the insulation on it. Always do the final torque down by hand. And that's pretty much it. Put your coils back in. Put your 10mm bolts back in. Tighten those back up. Put your intake manifold back on. Easy peasy. That right there is the vacuum line that goes to that. That I believe is for the PCV, and that one I believe is for the vacuum brake booster. And those 2 connectors go onto that bracket. Make sure you wipe your intake manifold gasket off or replace it. If you are doing this job and it's your car, you should probably just go ahead and replace the gasket. They're not that expensive, but they don't leak. I've not had one of them leak yet. So, and even with really high mileage cars, I've never seen one leak. So it should be okay to reuse it if you have to. And besides, it's pretty easy to change those gaskets if you need to later. Doesn't take much to lift it up, slide it out, and put your new one back in there. But just make sure it's clean when you put it back together. Doesn't have to be spick and span, but you don't want any big, large pieces of debris getting in there and stopping it from sealing. Now that's the power steering line right there in the back. You can see how it goes on. Make sure you don't forget to put that 12mm bolt back in there and secure that power steering line back to the back of the intake manifold. Put your vacuum lines on, put your connectors back onto their brackets. Make sure you put the clamps back onto the vacuum lines. Those 90-degree needle noses are very handy. I don't know what I'm saying right there, but just make sure you put those studs back in. E8, don't forget. External Torx. Now at this point, you're going to want to install those 12 millimeters that hold the upper intake manifold in, but you don't want to tighten them all the way up. Just put them in, run them all the way down by hand, and just leave them a couple of turns loose, because you don't want to tighten them all the way up, and then you're not going to be able to put those 3 bolts in the front of the intake manifold on because there's tension on it. So you want to put the intake manifold on, get that tightened up completely first, and then tighten those 2 12 millimeters in the back up. Tighten those all the way up. Just follow along with the video. Basically, you want to get your intake manifold seated, fully seated, tightened down before you tighten up that bracket. But you do want to put those 12 millimeter bolts in before you tighten down the intake manifold, because you want to be able to get those bolts into those holes. They may not line up once you got the intake manifold torqued all the way down. Now you want to tighten them up completely. And that's just me demonstrating the magnet in the socket. Sun X socket, magnetic, 12 millimeter. It's a really handy set. Get you that set, links in the description. I use it all the time. I want to see if I can find me a 3/8 inch set. Magnetic. I don't think I saw one of those, but there's got to be one out there somewhere. Just make sure you plug everything in, put everything back where it goes. Exhaust gas temperature sensor, 10 millimeter. Vacuum switching valve actuator, 10 millimeter. Vacuum reservoirs, 12 millimeter. Put your intake boot on, but don't forget to plug your EGR valve in. I almost forgot to plug it in, so you see me, backpedaling a little bit there. Now the clamps, they have a keyway on them so that they can be locked into the correct position. Make sure you put them in the correct position. There's a cutout with a little notch. Make sure that lines up. The clamp closest to the throttle body is a 10 millimeter. The clamp closest to the air filter is an 8 millimeter. Then you put your breather on, put your clamp on. 90-degree needle noses coming in handy again. Yes, they do. And I believe we are all done here. Put your engine cover on with the 5 millimeter hex bolts. There are 4 of them. Well, on this car there was only 3. But we did put a 10 millimeter in at the end of it, just to secure it, make sure it's not flapping around making any noises. 5 millimeter hex bolt, tighten them all up. Yep, tighten them all up eventually. I don't know what I'm waiting for in this video. Probably explaining something that didn't make it into the video. But anyway, I assure you I tightened those up. Or maybe I did tighten them up and I just didn't. Whatever. Tighten your engine cover up. We're also doing an air filter on this car. The best way to do an air filter on this vehicle is to just loosen that air filter housing up. Just do it the way you see me doing it right there. Because when you leave that clamp attached, a lot of times you don't have the flexibility to get that air filter